Today, we're going to be speaking with Dr. John Krystal, who's a psychiatrist and Yale University professor, maybe best known for the discovery of the rapid antidepressant effect of ketamine in depressed patients. Dr. Krystal, really great having you on. I appreciate it.
Really a pleasure to be here today.
So maybe to start with, before we talk about ketamine specifically, it'd be great to hear from you a little bit about depression more generally. You know, you talk to 5 different psychiatrists, you'll often get 5 at least slightly different answers about to what degree is depression situational or caused by a chemical or hormonal imbalance or some combination, or it depends on the particular case. What's your sense of our best understanding about depression at this point?
Sure. So I think there are some things that we can all agree on. One, that it's far more common than we ever thought. 2, that it has far more detrimental effects on people's lives than we probably had previously appreciated. And 3, that a lot of people who try to get treatment for depression find that the treatment that they start out with isn't giving them the kind of full response that they're looking for. And as a result, even for many people who are in treatment, depression continues to take a toll on them. And I think another thing that we would agree about depression is that it's really fundamentally different than having a bad day. Now, we've all had a bad day. We've all probably had moments of despair even. But to sit in that state all day, every day, or most of every day, is a totally different experience that is hard to appreciate if you haven't been through it yourself. And so when we get to questions of causes, we have to appreciate that there are an enormous, depression is a very broad term, and there are probably many different kinds of depressions. And unfortunately, this is one area where psychiatry has not really led us to a satisfactory place. In other words, we appreciate that there are different types of depression that people might have. Some that are purely a reaction to bereavement or getting fired or having your marriage break up, and where you have an issue or a problem that you just can't kind of work through, and it takes you down into this really negative place. But there clearly are other people who have depression that comes on, as you point out, because of a hormonal imbalance, because of a medical problem, because of other kinds of things going on in the body. And we know a lot more about the interplay between the body and the brain in relation to depression than we ever did before. And one of the things that we've learned is that medical problems in the body, heart disease, asthma, arthritis, all of these things, even obesity, can contribute to a process in the body called inflammation, which, when we think of inflammation in our joint, we think of a sore joint. When we think of inflammation in the brain, it affects the way that the circuits are regulated and can contribute, we think, to depression. But there is also probably a genetic contribution. About 30% or so of the risk for depression is genetic. And one of the things that you can see in some people who don't have a major life stress and don't have a medical problem contributing is that some people out of the blue, just part of their own makeup, will experience depression. And that's really important in all of these cases. Whether it's primarily stress, primarily hormonal, primarily a genetic vulnerability, we're talking about this very complex interplay of a person and their surroundings. And so it's not surprising that we treat depression sometimes with psychotherapy, sometimes with medications, sometimes with both, and other things like getting a lot of social support, getting good exercise, having a healthy diet can all help people get their best chance of recovering from their depression.
So before we talk about ketamine, just briefly, treating depression with SSRIs. From the research I did before our interview, it seems like it's pretty clear that the SSRIs work better than placebo. They don't necessarily work at numbers that are incredibly overwhelming. It's not 90%, but it does
Right.
seem better than placebo. Is that still your understanding? And what exactly are SSRIs doing in the brain?
Yeah. Um, so first, absolutely, SSRIs are extremely helpful for many people, and so I'd say if people were just starting their having their first experience of depression and they get treated with an SSRI, that they could expect about a 50-50 chance of getting better from that SSRI. But the reality is that one of the things that we've learned about depression for many people, perhaps because of the complex interplay that we were talking about, is that it can be a chronic or recurring disorder. And so what sometimes happens is that people who maybe in their first episode responded to the SSRI find that later on the medication isn't working so well. So how SSRIs work is to raise the level of serotonin bathing the brain by preventing its reuptake after release. So it does increase the brain's exposure to depression, and then it's the brain's reaction to having so much serotonin around that evokes adaptive changes in the brain that help the regulation of mood and other aspects to function better. And and this process is dependent on the ongoing availability of serotonin in the brain. So if you stop the SSRI abruptly, many people will find that their depression symptoms will come back. Or if you just deplete the body of serotonin, deplete the brain of serotonin, even though people are staying on the SSRI medications, they may have a transient relapse. And that was done for research purposes to help to understand how these medications work. So that's a general introduction to the SSRIs.
So let's now talk a little bit about ketamine. Maybe what is ketamine? What were some of the early medical uses that at least it was tested for? And then how did this start to become something that was thought of as maybe effective for depression?
Yeah, well, to me, it's a remarkable story. So ketamine is a drug that was identified as an anesthetic medication in the 1960s. And a good friend and colleague, Dr. Ed Domino, first gave this drug to people and helped to describe its peculiar effects, which he and others called dissociative anesthesia, which is its capacity to produce a kind of twilight state that people sometimes call dissociation. And they didn't know how it worked when they discovered it. In fact, the field of neuroscience really didn't figure out how ketamine worked until the 1980s. And then what was found out then was that ketamine works by blocking the action of glutamate at one of its receptors called the NMDA subtype of glutamate receptor. Now you might say, wait, I've heard of serotonin before. I haven't heard of glutamate. And how is that? Why would you think of glutamate for depression? So this gets back to, in a way, the logic that carried us to test ketamine first in depressed patients, which is that for a long time, from the first identification of these transmitters to, I'd say, certainly the mid to late 1990s, maybe even later, most people thought of depression as a disorder of the norepinephrine, like noradrenaline, or serotonin systems of the brain. These are chemical systems in very primitive parts of the brain that project to the higher centers of the brain and tune the activity of these higher brain centers. So they reasoned if serotonin was awry, not functioning right, maybe if we give a serotonin reuptake inhibiting drug, we'll treat the symptoms of the depression by normalizing serotonin. Well, research by several groups, including the work done here at Yale by my colleague, Dennis Charney and Pedro Delgado, George Henniger, and others, they showed that if you deplete the body of serotonin, you don't produce depression. If you deplete the body of norepinephrine, you don't produce depression. And that the biology of depression is more complicated. In some ways, this was a kind of intellectual crisis moment for thinking about the biology of depression. And the way that Dr. Charney and I reasoned our way around this problem was to say, well, maybe if depression doesn't predominantly live in the serotonin or norepinephrine nerve cells themselves, maybe depression lives in the targets of norepinephrine and serotonin, the higher brain centers. And the two main brain centers we thought of were the cerebral cortex, the highest executive control of our thought and behavior and emotion, and the limbic system, the generators or drivers of emotional experience in the brain. And with that came a kind of an aha moment, which is if depression is a cortical disorder, not a brainstem disorder, then the intrinsic signaling mechanisms of these higher brain centers, the main information highways of the higher brain centers, should be involved in depression and its treatment. And those information highways involve the neurotransmitter glutamate as the main excitatory neurotransmitter of the cortex, like 90% of the synapses. So we thought, let's test a drug that blocks one of these glutamate receptors. The drug we chose to do that was ketamine. And what we found was this rapid improvement in mood within 24 hours, say, of a single dose of ketamine in a large number of the people we tested.
What is the dosage idea when it comes to ketamine? Is it the type of thing that is taken daily like an SSRI? Do the effects fall off similarly or differently? Like, how would it be administered?
Right. So Time Magazine called ketamine the antidepressant. And that is because it doesn't work like anything else we know. First, unlike a medication that you give a little bit of the drug, you don't have much effect of the drug, and you take it every day as part of your daily life. That's not at all what ketamine is like. What ketamine is you give a dose that is high enough to trigger the antidepressant response. And those antidepressant effects last a week or two in people. And so people generally start getting 2 doses a week, then after a month or so, 1 dose a week, then every other week. And so when people are maintained on it, if they need to be maintained on it, they may only get a dose once every 3 weeks or once a month. And by spreading it out, people don't become tolerant to it. They tend to, if anything, to become more sensitive to the antidepressant effects. And it turns out in the long-term data with S-ketamine, the version of ketamine developed by Janssen, that it's very helpful in preventing relapse of depression. And so that it's a good long-term treatment, as well as a strategy for producing a rapid antidepressant response and to help people who haven't previously responded to antidepressant medications.
Are the doses large enough when they are given that they have a sort of psychoactive or maybe dissociative type effect?
When given in the way that we and both we in our laboratory with ketamine and later Janssen with S-ketamine give ketamine, yes, they tend to produce psychoactive effects. They can make people feel spacey. They can have altered sensory perception. They might experience, for example, that their arm or their fingers feel longer, or they may have a feeling that the room is breathing in or out. And what we find is that if we prepare people for those kinds of effects, if we're with them when they are having those experiences, and then if we can have the chance to talk about them afterwards, that people can both understand what's going on, not find it very frightening, and have overall a good experience.
Last thing I wanted to ask about, what's the sort of regulatory and legal status right now of using ketamine in this way per the FDA?
Yes. So S-ketamine, the S isomer of the ketamine molecule, ketamine comes in two mirror images. And so one of the mirror images, the S isomer of ketamine, is developed by Janssen and approved by the FDA for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression and depression in the context of suicide risk. The standard ketamine that's used in anesthesia is approved by the FDA for anesthesia.
Right.
And what that means is that doctors can prescribe the racemic ketamine for the whatever they want, but it is not approved by the FDA for the treatment of depression. And that means that doctors who are prescribing this form of ketamine have some additional liability because it's not endorsed by the FDA. Also, the consequence of it not being approved by the FDA is that some insurance companies only cover the S-ketamine version. The S-ketamine version is given as a nasal spray, and people take a certain number of puffs of the nasal spray that's appropriate for them and worked out with their doctor. That version of S-ketamine, that version of ketamine, the S-ketamine, is FDA approved and increasingly covered by insurance and Medicare and Medicaid.
We have been speaking with Dr. John Krystal, who's a psychiatrist and Yale University professor. Really interesting, and we look forward to reading more about these uses. Really appreciate your time today.
It's wonderful to be here and to talk about this area. So thanks for having me on.